Okay. Hey guys, happy Sunday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Dr. Matt Smith with us this evening, and we did send a bio out, so I'm not going to go into a full introduction, so we can make the most use of his 30 minutes and of his time and of your time. So we immediately are going to dive in. I honestly have a ton of questions, but if something does come up, please go ahead and type it in the chat, and we could try to hit those as well. We are going to start with the first one, and that is, what is the most common strength and mobility exercises you recommend for cycling performance specifically?
I would say the most common I recommend is some variation of consistent strength training that also incorporates some degree of mobility. So when we think about, mobility for cycling, generally speaking, every athlete that I work with individually, we do a full assessment of mobility and get really targeted with what we work on. We also do the same thing for strength work. But from a general standpoint, I think, focusing on hip, mid-back, and ankle mobility for cycling is critical. That's just, those three common areas, not only for cycling, but really for triathlon in general. Those are three key areas that I would certainly focus on, and there's a variety of different drills that you can do, but some variation of tissue work followed by long hold stretching and then active range of motion work as far as mobility goes. From a strength training perspective, it really depends on the frequency that we're training and the capability of the athlete, but generally speaking, I like to incorporate primary lifts like, some variation of a squat, whether it's a back squat, front squat, goblet squat, some variation of that, as well as a deadlift. And then beyond that, having accessory lifts like single leg squatting or lunge patterns and single leg deadlifting, like a kickstand deadlift or just a single leg RDL. Those are kind of the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of the strength work that I do. And then beyond that, incorporating some degree of core training that incorporates a variety of different planes and a variety of different activation techniques are generally what I'll work with, not only for cyclists, but also for triathletes in general.
Very good. Thank you. What are the most common mobility or strength deficits that you're seeing in endurance athletes? And obviously, how does this impact performance over time?
The most common, I mentioned a moment ago, just the three key ones are mid-back, hips, and ankles are very commonly limited, especially with runners and cyclists. And so those are the three key areas that I'll look at or have people just generally work on. And in regards to maintaining those regions, I think having a consistent mobility practice doesn't even have to be every day, but even once a week, having a system of movements that you check in with to notice any discrepancy in your range of motion, that is, that could even be a warm-up, right? If it's your warm-up in your strength training, that's a very simple way to check in with your body and see if you're regressing in terms of mobility or, you're starting to tighten up in certain areas. And then having action items, a routine that you follow or multiple routines that you follow to attack those different areas, I think are really helpful ways to stay on top of that.
Awesome. So most of these athletes, they're focused on their endurance training, and they understand that strength training is so vitally important as well, but just trying to find that balance between the two. When do you suggest incorporating strength? Are there specific days around their training that you suggest that? And what do you like to have your athletes do? Like, how many times, you mentioned these deadlifts and squats, how often do your athletes kind of hit these bigger lifts?
It's the frequency and volume of strength training varies with pretty much every athlete. Generally speaking, I like to have a frequency of 2 times a week of primary strength days. And then beyond that, we can incorporate some degree of mobility and accessory core work with an extra day if an athlete wants to. But especially with athletes that are training 15 to 25 hours a week or more, sneaking in strength can get a little bit more complicated. And so I have athletes do it in a variety of different ways. Some athletes prefer to have, well, I'll start by saying you do not want to replace a rest day with strength training. Strength training is not rest. You certainly want to maintain rest days as rest days. That is the most common thing that I see people make mistakes with in regards to strength training. As far as mobility or a light core session, you can certainly do that on a rest day, but do not have a primary strength day on a rest day. In regards to how to place it during your week, athletes that I work with will generally do it in two different ways. One is make your hard days hard. And so placing your strength work on days that you would have key workouts or intervals on the bike or in one of the disciplines, your key workouts in one discipline. That is a really simple way to do it. If you do that, I generally recommend doing your endurance or aerobic work first and then do your strength training after, so that we keep the primary thing the primary thing. And that's a really important thing to note, is that, you know, I do a lot of strength training and just injury prevention work and rehab work with athletes, but the key thing to remember when you're incorporating anything like strength training is that it's all done with the purpose to enhance what you're already doing aerobically. And so when it comes to, you know, feathering in strength training, you want to do it in a way that does not interfere with key workouts. That is the, you know, when I get together and I'm working with a professional athlete or communicating with an athlete who I work with, you know, if I'm communicating with their coach, I consider myself an assistant coach. The strength work is accessory work in regards to the primary work that is the aerobic training. And so we never want to have the effect. And if you're just introducing strength training for the first time, this can be a little bit tricky. You might need a few weeks or a few reps to kind of figure out how to feather it in properly, but you do not want to have strength training impact those key workouts negatively. So that's really, really important. So option one is have your hard days be hard, put your strength training on key workout days, but make it after your key workout. The other way to do it is to take an endurance ride day or a light day running or swimming and throw your strength training in there. A lot of times I'll have athletes do that, and they do their strength training first on those days and then do their endurance after. So two options, pretty simple to do. But the key there is, if you want to maintain consistency with strength training and make sure it's a part of your plan, give yourself a small dose, make it very manageable, and don't overreach in the gym. You just have to remember that the consistency of strength training, small bites over time, lead to a very, very big change in your performance. And that's the biggest thing that I have to communicate to athletes all the time. Because a lot of people, when they're, you know, starting to incorporate strength training, we always envision strength training as this really heroic thing that we're doing. And a lot of people perceive it as kind of a montage effort. And it's so important to keep things really simple, really consistent, and very manageable. And over time, that tends to build really well.
Great. That's great advice. What would be your go-to advice for injury prevention for athletes?
Injury prevention for athletes, I think the number one thing is top three things would be consistent training, being consistent with your training over time, giving yourself adequate rest, and making sure that your nutrition and hydration are really good. So keeping those three keys consistent and good over time is really those are the fundamentals to preventing injury. It's where you consistently overreach and make these heroic efforts in training and overwhelm your system and don't give it adequate rest or nutrition to rebuild, that we start running into problems. The other thing is, you know, just not listening to your body, not listening to what's going on, and not perceiving how your body is doing is the number one way to get injured, especially when it comes to, you know, chronic stress injuries like we see in endurance sports. but it's, I do think the consistency of training is really the number one thing. And in order to maintain consistency, you need to have that ebb and flow of training, right? We need to periodize training and make sure that we're building for certain periods, and then we're giving our body that recovery period to super compensate and make sure that we're continuing to build. But beyond that, if you're just getting into triathlon or you're just getting into some leg of the endurance game, it's trying to play the 10-year game as opposed to the 10-week or 10-month game even. It's making the decision that you're going to set yourself up in a way that you'll continue to be able to show up no matter what. And whether that's, eliminating the pressure of intensity and just making sure that you can continue to do consistent efforts over time. There's a lot of different ways to address this, but that's really, those are the little regions as far as, touch points with sport that I see people get injured the most. And then, as far as, the most optimal situation, you guys are already doing that. You're already taking part in a team and being coached by Natasha and her staff. And honestly, that's one of the absolute best ways to stay out of the injury bucket and be able to continue training, is having a really intelligent and thoughtful staff that's working with you and managing your training.
Awesome. Okay, so we have athletes on here in their young 20s, and then we have athletes on here that are 60, 70 years old.
Cool.
How do you address the strength training for those two categories, especially, and let's start with the older category and just longevity in the sport? What would you say to them?
Well, I think not that differently, actually. When it comes to strength training, we use principles, right? And those principles can span across, varied domains and varied age groups. I've personally worked with, everyone from teenagers all the way up into people in their 80s and 90s. And so as far as strength training goes, those same fundamentals of not overreaching. I mean, I would love to say that masters athletes have more wisdom and tend to not overreach as much as, athletes in their 20s. That is absolutely not true for the most part. And I think that it comes back to maintaining good fundamentals. If you're in your 20s, play the long game. Don't treat it like a single season effort, and make sure that you're stacking year to year. And what I said earlier about figuring out those manageable bites, especially from a strength training perspective, figuring out what is manageable over time is really the key to maintaining a good strength training and injury-free journey in the endurance game. With masters athletes, it's really about managing some of the historical stuff that comes up. So most masters athletes, if you're over the age of 25 years old, you've probably dealt with some version of an injury in your athletic career. And I think making sure that you honor that when you come into the gym for strength training and make sure that you're taking that into consideration is so critical. I'm working with someone right now who's he's the dad of one of the Olympians that I work with, and he's been doing the workouts that I've been giving the Olympian, and he keeps running into these issues. So he's in his 60s, and so we're reworking, because he has historical stuff. He's getting ready for a couple hip replacements and has had some historical lower back injuries, and so to hold yourself to the standard of an Olympian who has very little injury history and very little going on in that right is totally inappropriate, and is the fastest way to finding yourself amplifying previous injuries that you've had. So if you are a masters athlete, it's really the same story, but just slightly different in the fact that you probably have a little bit more seasoning to your athletic journey, and you probably have some historical stuff that you really need to respect when it comes to your gym work. And so those are the way that I would kind of address both ends of the spectrum there.
Awesome. Here's a question that's not on your list, but came in today, and it was dollar for dollar. What is the best recovery tool an athlete could have?
Dollar for dollar. Sleep.
Yeah.
Sleep and hydration.
And then if there was a physical tool out there for recovery where you say definitely this would be the one, is there anything out there outside of that? I guess it depends.
Dollar for dollar. I mean, it's I have so many different tools and have played around with so many different things over the years. You know, one of the most underutilized things, this is not an absolutely necessary thing, but it is one of my favorite tools that most people don't use. And if they, and most people haven't even, really used it other than being in a physical therapy or chiropractic office. And that's a stim machine. Those Compex units are awesome, whether it's Compex or a Mark Pro or something like that. Those are the electrodes that you put on and make your muscles fire. That is one of the best ways to stimulate your lymphatic system and flush an area, and also reduce spasm and tension in muscle groups. That's, if you're going to pay for something, that's something fancy, we'll say. You can get those for about 150, 200 bucks. And honestly, those things are unbelievable. And I recommend to pretty much every athlete that I work with, especially if you're in that master's bucket, get one of those things and have it on hand. Because if you tweak something and you want a quick turnaround to flush the area and get inflammation or swelling out of an area, it is so easy to use and so simple and does wonders. So that's what I would pay for, beyond like a foam roller or, something like that. That's not as exciting of an answer. So
No, it's good. It's very good. I appreciate that. I want to get to a specific, we have a few athletes that keep, especially if they're new to the sport, but they have like lower leg injuries. And so specifically, we have someone that asked about chronic plantar fasciitis. Doesn't get rid of it. Like, have you found to be the best treatment for that?
chronic plantar fasciitis. Well, first you want to get a good diagnosis. Make sure that it is plantar fasciitis, because there's some other stuff that could appear like plantar fasciitis and is not plantar fasciitis. So I would make sure that you get a good diagnosis, whether that's using, MSK ultrasound to check out the area or getting an MRI. Make sure that you get with a good sports medicine pro that can help you diagnose the area. If it is truly plantar fasciitis, the question was what to do with it?
Yeah. What on treatment wise works?
Oh, you can use a variety of things. There's everything from hands-on techniques, like active release technique is one of my favorites. If you are going to be seeing a provider on a regular basis as an injury prevention mechanism, getting with someone that does good active release technique. And actually, if you guys live in Austin, I lived in Austin for a little bit and worked at a place called Wellsport. Wellsport is awesome as far as their treatment and approach to injuries. But so as far as plantar fasciitis goes, doing some degree of hands-on work, whether that's active release techniques, some Graston or scraping techniques, can be quite helpful for reducing pain and helping to normalize some of that tissue. Beyond that, shockwave therapy is another great option. There are other things like PRP injections or stem cell injections. I mean, you can go down a wild rabbit hole, depending on the degree of plantar fasciitis or the degree of injury to the plantar fascia and what's going on. But the other thing that a lot of people do not take into consideration is managing volume on your feet. So the best anti-inflammatory that you can ever take is not creating additional inflammation for your body to deal with. And so making sure that you are modifying your training, switching to cross training, and finding ways to continue to build your aerobic system without irritating that plantar fascia. That's one of the absolute best things that you can do beyond getting that passive therapy.
Awesome. Side question. Are you seeing more and more injuries with the carbon plated shoe?
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that. The carbon plated shoe is very fascinating because you, yeah, it's had I think we're just seeing the effects that it is having on the running industry at large. But I wouldn't say that I'm seeing more injuries because of the carbon plated shoe. I think people, it's hard because switching in and out of carbon plated shoes really changes your biomechanics.
Yeah.
And so if you're not thoughtful about the way that you do that and you don't do appropriate training, if you're going to use carbon plated shoes on race day and you haven't really trained in them, that is a recipe for a major problem. But I've there's been arguments for less injuries with carbon plated shoes. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say, but most of it comes down to being thoughtful about how it's like any new pair of shoes, right? You integrate it. It's a very special new pair of shoes, but it's all about the way that you integrate it into your training and making sure that you are not overreaching with a new pair of shoes, making sure that you give yourself adequate time to adapt to that pair of shoes so that you know what you're getting on race day is a really important part of the carbon shoe game, I would say.
Awesome. So we have a couple athletes that I know on this call. They will keep cramping up in their sessions, and it's not hydration, electrolyte. It's definitely like the muscles stop firing.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found as far as just utilizing strength training, utilizing sports specific, be it intervals? Like, what have you found to help those athletes kind of conquer that?
I've had a handful of athletes come to me in the last couple years with chronic cramping, especially with some of these gravel events that go. I mean, these gravel events are crazy now. But at the tail end of a gravel race or even an Ironman, and we've had great success with implementing strength training and reducing cramping. So if it isn't nutrition related or hydration related, strength training is one way, and there's a decent amount of research on it. I was actually, I was pretty hesitant to say that strength training could impact cramping, but the effects that I've seen in the last few years have been pretty remarkable. So I would certainly consider strength training, especially, if you are cramping in one particular area. Addressing that in your strength training routine could be a great way to start to work through that and strengthen that area to reduce compensation and that sort of thing that generally will lead to cramping.
Awesome. Very good. Guys, we have a few more minutes. If anyone has any specific questions, type it in the chat. Matt, we see on your Instagram, by the way, guys, Matt has a great Instagram where he posts a lot of videos of exercises that you can do to complement your training. There's always a lot of core training. How often do your athletes do specific core work? Is it in addition to their say 2 lifts per week? Can you overdo core work?
I would say I post a little more core work than I would recommend doing, mostly because I'm aware of the game of Instagram. But in terms of the frequency of core training, it depends on the schedule. So if it's tough for you to get 2 days of strength training in, and we're talking 30 to 45 minute sessions of strength training. Some athletes will do more around the 60 to 90 minute range, but 30 to 45 minutes, that is great strength work, honestly. And generally speaking, if you are tied to 2 days a week of, cross training in the gym, then you can incorporate plenty of core work in with your primary strength lifts. So the way that I generally will build workouts is I'll select anywhere from 6 to 8 exercises in a given workout, and we'll have our primary lifts, and then we'll have 2 to 3 core exercises that we're working on, and there will be a really specific way that those things are built out. But that's, if you're tied to 2 days a week, that's a great way to do it. Just get it in during your strength sessions. If you want to do an additional core training day, then that's, I generally will give people 15 to 20 minute routines that they do once a week in addition to their 2 primary strength days.
All right. We have a lot of athletes on the call that they have lower back pain, especially on the bike. And we know could be a number of reasons like tight hips or weak glutes. Like what do you historically see when an athlete comes to you with lower back pain that just doesn't go away?
Lower back pain specifically on the bike?
Yes.
Well, beyond, bike fit and training volume, beyond those two things, if it's physically related, the big things to check if you're having lower back pain is get an assessment of your mobility, getting a check of your hip mobility. We've got 49 people on this call. If I would bet a lot of money that 0% of the people on this call know whether or not they have 40 degrees or more of hip external rotation, which is critical for cycling, or 30 degrees or more of hip internal rotation. Most athletes that I work with, it's very rare that I would run into an athlete who knows what degree of hip mobility they have. So that's number one thing to check, is get with a pro and get yourself assessed, because that will tell you, hey, am I dealing with a hip mobility issue that's causing my lumbar erectors or lower back muscles to overwork, or my psoas to overwork, that's creating more irritation in my low back? Or do I have a restriction that's preventing me from being in a good aero position on the bike? Or, there's a lot of different scenarios there. But that's number one. So get your mobility checked. Make sure that your movement is not full of compensation and you're not running into injuries or issues from that end of things. And then beyond that, core strength is a huge kicker in regards to lower back pain on the bike. Making sure that you have good postural strength and the ability to maintain support of your lower back via the core is super, super important on the bike. I'm a very big advocate for making sure that your core is strong and you're maintaining that. So I can't tell you how many stories I have heard of people implementing strength training and finding that their lower back pain on the bike dissipates. It is just so common to have that happen. And so that's a huge one, making sure that your core is nice and strong and your hips and ankles are mobile enough for you to move freely on the bike in a way that doesn't cause lower back compensation.
Awesome. Okay, we have time for one more thing. Matt, was there something I didn't ask that you have 49 people to speak to that you're like, they need to know this?
Yeah. I think there was a question about the let me actually pull this up real fast. Oh, it was about endurance athletes worrying about strength training impacting their endurance performance. Just in terms of the value of strength training and the way that it impacts performance. I think that especially for athletes who stay in the sagittal plane, the forwards and backwards plane, like triathletes, okay? We're all triathletes on this call, and we all spend a lot of time moving forwards. It is so critical for us to incorporate movements outside of the forward and backward plane. And it's easiest done through mobility and strength training. It's just so easy to work different angles with our joints and take pressure off the areas of joints that we put pressure on constantly when we're moving in that forwards and backwards plane. And so if I was going to make one pitch for strength training, especially from the idea of like talking to a 20-year-old versus a 70-year-old, you really want variance in your movement. And we spend so much time specializing in that forwards movement that we miss out on a lot of the really key movements that maintain health of our joints long term. And so that's where all the strength training is nice for enhancing endurance performance, but it's really about maintaining longevity. It is 100% about introducing varied movement to our joints and tissues to allow our body to adapt to other stimuli other than the things that we give it through our triathlon training. So I think, as far as being a zealot, I am a zealot for varied movement and making sure that we're moving in multiple planes in order to keep our joints and body healthy long term.
Awesome. Amazing, Matt. We really appreciate you getting on the call tonight and giving us all your insight. Guys, before you leave, I just have 3 quick announcements. Number one, the kits are available if you haven't seen, and now we also have colors for men and women. So there's a pink kit for men and there's a blue kit for women. I actually had a bunch of requests on that. And the store is open for another week. And then the other is we have a partnership with Garmin. Whoever wants a discount is 35% off any Garmin products, but we all have unique discount codes for each person. So you have to email me to get a unique discount code if you want to purchase anything from Garmin. And then that is it. So Matt, thank you so much. Guys, everybody else, we will see you next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you guys.
All right. Okay, I have a couple